Okay, we're going to move on to our next panel, which focuses on Iran sanctions and non-proliferation efforts from a regional perspective. And we're very lucky to have two of the top experts in town on Iran sanctions. And I think what characterizes the work of both Dr. Patrick Clawson and Dr. Ken Katzman is that not only do they manage to see the big picture of all the actors, but they actually are quite proficient in the details. What's moving where, which entities. Sometimes we have these big picture theories, but really, indeed, the devil is in the details. And I think we're very fortunate to have both of them that really can address the nuts and bolts also of the sanctions regimes. And really the bordering states, whether it's in the Gulf or Turkey or the South Caucasus, are crucial to the sanctions regimes, both as a maker and a breaker. And you see that Iran frequently wants us to use the banking system or commodities cells in order to circumvent the banking sanctions. So bordering states are crucial to the regime. So with whether they're on or off, it's going to be quite important to the success. So we'll start with our first speaker with Dr. Patrick Clawson from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
Well, I thought it would be useful to explain why it is that I think that U.S. sanctions are not a principal impediment to economic relations between the South Caucasus countries and Iran. And in order to do that, you'll pardon me, but I want to say some things about how it is that Iran views the South Caucasus countries. I know people here know the South Caucasus much better than I do, but I flatter myself to think that I know a little something about Iran, and I want to talk a little bit about how the relationship looks from the Iranian side. Now, it's easy to emphasize the close ties between Iran and the South Caucasus. There are certainly deep people-to-people ties. There's been a lot of migration back and forth, similar groups on both sides of the borders. And there are certainly many natural symmetries that should lead to deep economic relationships between the two. I mean, just to take one example, in many ways, one of the easiest transport routes into northern Iran, where much of the population lives, would be through the South Caucasus. I enjoy writing about the history of Iran, and remember seeing doing some archival research, and the British consul in Bushehr on the Persian Gulf coast was appointed to the legation in Tehran. And it was debating, this was in the 1880s, and was debating how to get from Bushehr to Tehran. And they said, well, there were two choices. One choice was to go overland, but that trip took about 2 months, and it was full of mud and ice and unpleasant, and that in the same 2-month period, they could instead get on a ship, go through the Suez Canal, go past Istanbul to Erzurum, get on the railroad and go to the Katzman and Zeli, and then come up to Tehran. And that was the more comfortable route. That's pretty nutty. And it shows how there are many advantages for the cities of northern Iran if they could make use of the transport routes that came in through the southern Caucasus. And indeed, for a long historical period, Iran's relationship with the Southern Caucasus was absolutely central to its economy. And indeed, one of the centerpieces of I've finished a book on the history of money in Iran, 1500 to 1925, recommended. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, the whole area of what's now northwestern Iran and northeastern Turkey, as well as much of the Southern Caucasus, was extremely important to the world economy because of the production of silk. The third largest import into England in the 17th century was silk coming from this part of the region. The arrival of the silk convoy each year, this armada each year into Venice, was a holiday in the city because it was the biggest day in the country's economy. And at that time, Of course, the Ottomans and the Safavids fought repeatedly over control over this region because it was such a valuable region economically. And then if we come to a more recent period, certainly from 1820 until 1946, the question of the Russian and then Soviet role was absolutely central to the history of Iran. We see loss of territory to the Russian Empire and then repeated interventions in Iran. It's really the Russian troops which put an end to the Constitutional Revolution of 1906 to 1911, and of course the occupation from 1941 to 1946 of northwestern Iran. But since 1946, Iran's ignored the South Caucasus. That is, has not given the South Caucasus the attention that you would think that it would deserve. And that has only intensified under the Islamic Republic of Iran. And what we've seen is ham-handed, ugly Persian superiority. You know, the expression about ugly Americans, well, the ugly Persians can be at least as clueless about how others view them and about the other societies. And I just to cite two examples of episodes beginning in the early 1990s and continuing onwards, the Caspian Sea division story. I mean, the positions that Iran took in the debates about the division of the Caspian Sea were remarkably ill-designed to advance Iran's own interests and remarkably insensitive to their neighbors' interests and concerns. And while Iran thought that its approval would be necessary for economic development in the region and that the projects, the energy projects, would not proceed without a division of a formal division of the Caspian Sea, they were wrong. They were wrong. They tried overplaying their hands and got less than they could have gotten. And similarly, we see in the debates about pipelines in the early 1990s. Yes, it's easy to tell that story about how U.S. sanctions and U.S. pressure prevented the construction of pipelines or the utilization of pipelines that go via Iran, but I think that the Iranians' own positions had at least as much to do with the decisions that were made about which pipelines would be built and what pipelines to use. Iran's track record as with transporter pipelines is terrible. I mean, what it did with the pipeline that was built during the Soviet days, about unilaterally cutting off the pipeline repeatedly in order to try to jack up the price beyond what was in the negotiated contracts. The position that it took with Turkmenistan and Turkey about the transit of gas from Turkmenistan to Turkey, which was jaw-droppingly unreasonable. And so I would say that it's the Iranian assumption that they hold the key role and that others will have to bend to accommodate Iranian demands, which has been the central problem in advancing Iranian-South Caucasus economic relations. And I do not see the any end of U.S. sanctions changing this. I don't see any awareness in Iran, for instance, of the fundamental change which has taken place in the economic relationships in the region with the very considerable development of Azerbaijan's gas and oil energy resources. I mean, after several hundred years in which the Iranian Azeri areas were more prosperous than the areas what's now the Azerbaijani Republic, that has changed. And they're just by every social indicator as well as cash income, the areas in the Azerbaijani Republic are sharply richer than the Azeri populated areas of Iran. And Iranian leaders are blissfully unaware of this. Simply continue to assume that they hold the upper hand. I mean, the gentleman is usually thought to be the closest to Supreme Leader Khamenei is the editor of Kayhan, Hossein Shariat Madari, who is a very influential figure in Iranian foreign policy circles, and a hardline figure, to be sure, among the most hardline. But that editorial that he wrote about how Iran should insist that there be a referendum in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan about rejoining Iran, which was, after all, not much more than a year ago. I mean, it would not enter his mind that there would be any doubt about how such a referendum would turn out. It's inconceivable to him that anybody could doubt how such a referendum would turn out. That's the kind of attitude that Iranian decision makers bring when thinking about the positions to take vis-a-vis the Southern Caucasus on all kinds of trade issues. And this is quite remarkable because, in fact, especially with the considerable development that's been taking place in the region, not least of which is in Azerbaijan, there are real economic opportunities for Iranian firms. That, after all, Iranian firms which produce a great many consumer goods are well positioned to compete in the Azeri market because they're so much closer than China. They well be able to compete with Chinese products. I mean, haven't been there to observe it, but if we look at the trade statistics and newspaper articles, it certainly sounds as if there are already quite a few people from the Azerbaijan Republic who will cross over into Iran to go shopping because goods are cheaper there. And there are also lots of opportunities for Iranian companies to run projects in Azerbaijan. Iranian companies have actually gotten to be quite experienced at doing large infrastructure projects and do them quite well. For instance, Iranian cement manufacturers are world leaders in the production of cement which is earthquake resistant. And I think that could sell quite well. And for that matter, the Iranian railway system has, after years of very substantial investments and management upgrades, become quite efficient and is really quite an attractive way to ship goods into the South Caucasus. But I cannot see this being widely used. And indeed, the only substantial economic interaction that I'm aware of in recent years has been the considerable Iranian investment into Georgia that was taking place for a while. And I think that, if anything, that just proves my point, because that investment was not really because of business opportunities in Georgia. This was primarily a way to try to avoid the sanctions, and primarily a way to try to get front companies that could be used in order to avoid the sanctions. And therefore, if the sanctions went away, frankly, so would Iranian interest in such front companies. I just can't see them being excited about that. So I must tell you that I could go through chapter and verse of the sanctions and why it will continue to be the case that the United States government will watch very closely Iran's neighbors to see if there are front companies being established and try to determine ways in which Iranians are bypassing restrictions. And the U.S. government will indeed come down very hard on those who are eating at the edges of the U.S. and European restrictions about transactions with Iran. But I just don't think that that's going to be the principal constraint on the relationship. I think that, in fact, the poor political relationships that Iran has with the Azerbaijan Republic and the superior attitude that Iran brings to all the South Caucasus countries is going to be the principal barrier. That said, it will continue to be the case that because Armenia has such poor choices for trading partners, it will continue to rely upon Iran to quite a considerable extent, obviously for energy, but also for all of its trade. And I don't think that's because of the attractiveness of Iran. I think it's because of the difficulties that Armenia has using other alternatives. So.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ken Katzman, Congressional Research Service.
Thank you very much. Following Patrick reminds me of how much I need to up my game. He gets off from work and writes books on Iran's money in the, what is it,
1500s.
15, and I go home and watch reality TV. Actually, Survivor's on tonight, by the way. Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be back in Georgetown. I actually took classes in Georgetown when I moved to Washington. My PhD is from NYU, but I was working here, so I took classes and enjoyed it a lot. So thank you. I wanted to start off commenting on a few things I've heard since I've been here. I totally agreed with Bob Einhorn on the political dynamics on the Iranian nuclear, but I would explain it as someone who, I guess, watched Iran for a couple of decades at least. There's two schools of thought in the Iranian leadership. One camp believes that they can pursue the nuclear program slowly, under the radar, so as not to bring on sanctions and criticism, possibly military action. Mr. Rouhani and his mentor, Ali Akbar Rafsanjani, who was president for 8 years, they are in that camp. Their view is, we'll get there eventually, we'll get there, but we're going to do it without paying much of a price, but we'll be slower. It's okay. The other camp, which was exemplified by Mr. Ahmadinejad, who just left office in August, and I would say the supreme leader is in this camp too. Their view is, let's go as quickly as possible. Let's not worry about taking punishment. Let's get to where we need to be as quickly as possible, create facts, create leverage, and then the U.S. and its partners will have to negotiate and basically cave in, because we'll be so far along by then. It's more of sort of a North Korean approach, North Korea. So the Supreme Leader and Ahmadinejad were in that group. So that's how I see the differences, and I think they are quite fundamental. And Rouhani clearly is pursuing the Rafsanjani approach. Let's go slow. Let's not make enemies. Let's try to unwind these sanctions, and we'll get there anyway. We're not precluding our options forever. That's the argument. I would say also, I think it was very significant what was said about Azerbaijan being rich relative to the Azeri republics inside Iran, the Azeri inhabited areas of northwest Iran. And I think it's totally correct to say that the regime is clueless. The Iranian people, they have a lot of information about what's going on. It's not only Azerbaijan's growth rate. Qatar is growing at 8%, one of the richest countries on the planet. United Arab Emirates growing 8, 7, 8, well, maybe a little slower because they had a little bit of a recession, but clearly one of the richest countries on the planet. Iraq, which they fought an 8-year war with and lost, by the way. And then the US came in, and basically the place was a mess for several years, growing at 11%, exporting now more oil than Iran is. This is, the Iranian people, I would say, they notice this. They see this, and they are very embarrassed. The people I'm in touch with, you know, and obviously it's very difficult to have too much contact with people there, but the people I talk to on electronic media, very embarrassed, and it is noticed. So I would have those observations. Now I wanted to say, basically the thrust of my talk is, as you know, I work on Iran sanctions. I have this report on Iran sanctions for the U.S. Congress, and
Patrick wrote a book, you wrote a report.
all right, well, that's true. I didn't, okay.
He got paid more for his than mine.
His book is better than, but what I think the message of the report and my work, basically all the ground that can be possibly plowed with the Europeans and basically Iran's big trading partners in China, in East Asia, has been plowed. Most of the sanctions that can possibly be enacted to curb trading and interaction and oil purchases from the big countries, most of that ground has been plowed in terms of sanctions. Where the sanctions are having less success is in Iran's neighborhood. Again, I certainly don't pretend to be an expert on the Caucasus, and I am an expert on the Gulf, though, but this is what Iran counted on. I totally agree with what Bob Einhorn said. The Iranian leadership, when Resolution 1929 was passed on June 10th of 2010, which basically gave authority for all the countries in the world, if they wanted to cut off banking relationships with Iran, to stop selling major combat arms to Iran, gave all this authority, also even gave them authority to stop purchasing energy from Iran. Not all the countries used that authority, but that was authorized by the Resolution 1929. Iran's belief at the time was no one's going to cooperate. China and Russia tried to water down 1929. They did get some, they did water it down. There were some things that were going to be in 1929 that were stripped out about not buying Iranian government bonds, and things like this were taken out. Russia and China opposed them. But basically, the U.S. and its allies got what they wanted from 1929, which was all this authority, if one wanted to use it, to cut off these relations with Iran. And Iran's view is no one's going to cooperate, And then shock. Europe clearly came on board. East Asia, to a very large extent, maybe not completely, came on board. And Iran found itself isolated. Many governments used what really I would say shocked Iran was the way India sided with the United States and its partners. Iran counted on India. Iran and India have a lot of common interests and a lot of common positions. Afghanistan, they support the northern minorities against the Pashtuns, and there's a lot of cooperation between. There's, Pakistan. Obviously, India is always looking for ways to get around Pakistan and contain Pakistan. But India sided with the United States and its partners because India is becoming a modern economy, a much more modern economy than it was. And basically, the message of the sanctions, and you can read all these pages, the message is, you either do business with Iran or you do business with the United States. You choose. You have your choice. And the countries that have modern economies and want to be integrated into the world economy and into the international banking system and want to set up branches of their banks in the United States, the choice is very easy. Because the United States is a $15 trillion economy, and Iran is a $700 million, a billion-dollar economy. It's just that simple. And Europe combined is a 15, they're both about the same, EU and the United States. And then Asia, So, it's a no-brainer. So many companies, and even many Indian companies and companies in the region even, what they have done, and companies in Japan, I've talked to the Japanese, the South Koreans, even many Chinese companies, they have basically labeled Iran what's called a controversial market. Iran is now a third rail. It is poison. You don't do business with Iran because doing business with Iran is going to bring visits by U.S. Treasury officials, visits by U.S. State Department officials, congressional resolutions, congressional hearings possibly, congressional questions. Why are you doing business with Iran? It brings questions to companies that do business here. Well, you want to do business in the United States. I understand you're doing business in Iran. No one wants to touch it. It's poison. It'll kill your bottom line. That is why the sanctions have been as effective as they have. That is why Rouhani came to New York with a big smile and an op-ed piece and took a phone call, and it explains it, because Iran's economy is now almost totally isolated. The exception is Iran's neighborhood. Now, Iran, as I said, India is in Iran's neighborhood. Okay, they don't have a border, but it's the neighborhood. Neighbors, when the neighbors started siding with the United States, Iran got really, really nervous, because it's been counting on the neighbors to get out from the sanctions, to avoid the sanctions, to mitigate their effects, etc. India sided with the United States, and perhaps even more importantly, the United Arab Emirates sided with the United States. Basically, the UAE is an offshore branch of Iran's economy. Every Iranian trading house of any size has an office in Dubai. In fact, the UAE, this is because the UAE invited them in 20 years, 25 years ago, more. They invited them. They gave them offices. The UAE was fairly primitive itself, 30 years ago. It's just becoming much more modern very rapidly. But they were trying to build their economy, and they saw Iran as a ticket to become a trading hub. So they invited the Iranians in. A lot of Iranian businesses there, but even the UAE sided with the United States. Iraq, Iraq, obviously, Prime Minister Maliki's visiting, sort of hedges between the United States and Iran. The Gulf states are all allies of the United States. Afghanistan, we still have 50,000 troops. Not much ground for Iran to plow in Afghanistan. They've tried to trade some dollars there, because there's a lot of dollars to trade there, because the U.S. spends a lot of money there. But there's 50,000 troops. What is Iran going to do when there's 50,000 troops sitting in Afghanistan? Not a lot. Not a lot of running room there, except in Herat in the west. So there's really very few outlets for Iran to bust these sanctions, and that's why they've been so effective. Now, the Caucasus is a little bit of an exception. Maybe, again, I'm not an expert, but I think Iran has had a little more success in the Caucasus because there's some uncontrolled space, and there's been conflict, and Iran and Azerbaijan don't get along, and Iran and Armenia do get along, and Azerbaijan and Armenia are not getting along. So there's more ground for Iran to plow in the Caucasus, I would say. But the problem is, fundamentally, these are not huge economies. And, Iran is not going to break out. You're not going to make up oil sales to Japan, China, South Korea, Turkey, India with the South Caucasus. I mean, it's just not going to make up the money. So even though I think Iran has a little more play in the Caucasus, it's not going to deliver Iran from the grip of the sanctions. It's just not going to happen. Let's look at Iranian oil. Bob Einhorn mentioned this legislation in Congress that's pending. Okay. The fiscal year 2012 National Defense Authorization Act basically said your banks can continue to do business in the United States if you, country X, Y, Z, substantially reduce your oil purchases from Iran. What did that do? It cut Iran from 2.5 million barrels a day of oil exports in 2011 to 1.1 million barrels a day now. That's quite effective. That's very effective. Iran is losing $60 billion a year from that loss, that decline. Now, yes, they've made up a little bit in condensates and agricultural exports. You're not going to make up $60 billion with carpets. I mean, you might make up a couple of $100 million with carpets, but you're not going to make up $60 billion with caviar, So this is killing Iran, absolutely killing. Now, the legislation that's on the table, and I have to be very careful, as CERES when I talk about legislation. I'm not, can't say how I feel about it, but what it provides for is you can maintain that exception and continue to buy Iranian oil if you dramatically reduce purchases of Iranian oil, with the goal of cutting another 1 million barrels a day of Iranian exports within 1 year. So if Iran is exporting 1.2 million barrels a day today, and let's say this legislation were passed and signed and President Obama signed it tomorrow, 1 year from now, if it was completely enacted, and there are some off-ramps, if you're making best efforts to get to a de minimis effort, I don't want to get into all the detail. There are some loopholes in it. Don't quote me on the word loopholes, but there is some play in the language. But anyway, the goal, if it were enforced and implemented to the full effect, Iran would be exporting 200,000 barrels a day by this time next year. That is less than the Kurds in northern Iraq export. That is not enough money to sustain 80 million people, especially given the very, very generous social welfare system that they have there. So the purpose of my presentation is to, as you can tell, basically say the sanctions have been extremely effective because the U.S. has gotten this buy-in from all the partners, including partners and countries in the region, which Iran expected to run the other way from the United States, but yet, to Iran's shock, have cooperated with the United States. And that is why Iran is in so much economic trouble. Thank you.
Two fascinating presentations. If I can quote a few takeouts that were in these presentations. Ken Katzman, there's more ground to plow in the South Caucasus for Iran sanctions, and Patrick Clawson, that reduction of sanctions won't lead to an increase in trade between Iran and the South Caucasus. Some very interesting ideas. So I'd like to open it to questions. Please stand up and identify yourself, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Fakhreddin Ismailov. I'm from the Embassy of Azerbaijan. Previous presentations on the nuclear negotiations presented by Mr. Einhorn, it sounds quite optimistic to my ears, and the fact is that this optimistic discourse has been predominant at least in the mainstream media and in the statements of the officials participating at these negotiations. This is, in its turn, raises the public expectations from these negotiations. But today, my questions, without any particular intentions, are tuned on pessimism. And I wanted to know do you see this new round of negotiation as a last chance for diplomacy, or to rephrase it, do you agree with portrayal of this new round of negotiation as a last chance for diplomacy? And especially from the perspective of the neighboring countries, what kind of implications this possible failure may entail for these neighboring countries? Should we expect a new cycle of sanctions or other actions going beyond the sanctions? This is the question that probably the neighboring countries are asking while assessing the ongoing negotiation. Thank you very much.
Well, I like to describe the current round of negotiations as being like a high-wire trapeze act without a safety net, which is to say that if the artist proceeds all the way across this high wire to the other end, everyone applauds and it's wonderful. But on the other hand, if the person stumbles, the results are really quite tragic. And we have indeed created very high expectations, both Iranian leadership, world press, many governments, about where we're headed in this current round of negotiations. And yet we don't know in public whether or not there have been the kind of quiet contacts between the two sides about, well, look, what is it you're ready to accept? And that kind of quiet contact between two sides before you get involved in these public negotiations is what's happened with most great breakthroughs in relations in the past. And we don't know if that's happened or not in this case, because it's quiet. In many cases, it doesn't come out until years later. It was only years afterwards that we learned that before Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem that there had been quiet contacts between the Egyptian intelligence apparatus and the Israeli government at a very high level that determined that there was a basis for a peace treaty. And if, in fact, these negotiations break down in acrimony, or if they go nowhere, we don't have the kind of confidence-building measures that Bob Einhorn was talking about, and there's not much progress made on a framework agreement. And we get well into 2014 where this thing is dragging on. Then the great risk is that Iran's nuclear program is advancing sufficiently rapidly that Iran is acquiring a lot of different paths towards having the fissile material it needs for weapons. And that could make the Iranian leadership interested in a different path, making a breakout towards having fissile materials and a nuclear device. Something which, because of its large number of centrifuges and more advanced centrifuges, and is becoming easier and easier for Iran to do. And also, on the other hand, the other states in the area could become very nervous. And I don't think the Israeli government is going to act if there's a strong sense in the region and around the world that the negotiations are proceeding, but if there's a sense that the negotiations have effectively stalled or broken down, that'll be a very different story. And in particular, let me draw your attention to the fact that Iran, after many, many years, seems to be a year or less, it says months, out from completing a heavy water reactor. Now, this heavy water reactor is the kind that takes natural uranium, and after it's in the reactor and is irradiated, it produces as a byproduct plutonium. That's what the Chernobyl reactor did. And this is a very efficient way to produce the materials for nuclear weapons. Now, the last two heavy water reactors in the Middle East that were coming close to completion were in Iraq in 1980 and in Syria in 2005. Israel bombed both of them before they were loaded. There is universal consensus across the Israeli security and political establishment that if it looked like Iran was about to load its heavy water reactor in the town of Arak, A-R-A-K, that Israel would bomb it. It's not a difficult target to bomb. It's not heavily defended. It's above ground. And this would be a mission which Israel can eminently do. I'm not sure that Iran understands that. But that will happen. I mean, that will happen if the negotiations have broken down and it looks like Arak is going to be completed. Now, perhaps Iran can postpone the completion of Arak. After all, you know how long it took so many years to complete Bushehr, and some of the delays appeared to be political, and Iran has at times seemed to delay some of the things it's doing, in part not to cross Israeli red lines. But the point I'm making here is that if the negotiations break down, we will be in a very different situation.
I think what the discussion also points out is how fast-moving a situation we have. This time last year, everybody was talking about Iran's stockpile of 20% enriched uranium, and how if we could somehow get Iran to stop producing 20% enriched uranium, we might have a solution at hand. This year, that discussion has almost totally been overtaken by events. Now people are talking about Iraq, the plutonium route to a nuclear weapon. They need a reprocessing facility, which they don't have, and presumably we could find out if they're building that, but anyway. And they're installing of new model, new generation centrifuges. That has completely taken over the discussion this year. So resolving the issue of 20% uranium no longer represents a solution. And we're on to these other things. And whereas probably even I would have said last year, Israel probably does not have a little bit disagreement on how much ability they have to do the type of damage they need to do in Iran militarily. But Iraq, yes, the Iraq facility is above ground, very visible target. I have no doubt the Israelis could hit it successfully. Some of the other targets that were under discussion last year, I think I have a little more of a doubt on that. But, you know, I think fundamentally I'm not all that optimistic for a comprehensive settlement because, you know, having studied the Supreme Leader, and, you know, he was president from 1981 to 1989. He fundamentally distrusts the United States. He firmly believes the United States is, as Bob Einhorn said, out to change the regime, and I do not see him precluding Iran's options the way the U.S. is going to demand that they be precluded.
By the way, for the record, I'm more optimistic. I think it's more likely we'll get a deal than not. But I'm just saying what happens if we don't get a deal, and the results will be, well, we'll be in a very different place.
Thanks. Alex Peterson from the Wilson Center. To ask for a little bit more discussion on this idea that there is ground to plow in the South Caucasus for Iran to sort of avoid the sanctions. How much of that has to do, and this is actually a question to both Dr. Clawson and Dr. Katzman, how much of that does that have to do with the Armenian-Iranian relationship? And then on top of that, given Russia's control of the Armenian economy, how much of that has to do with the Russian-Iranian relationship? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, basically, Armenia is, Iran only really has two customers for gas right now, Turkey and Armenia, basically. But I mean, the stories I'm getting right now are focused not even on the two that you mentioned, but more on Georgia. You know, again, stipulation, I'm not an expert on the Caucasus dynamics, but for some reason, maybe it's because Georgia, you know, has had this let's call it a difference of opinion with Russia. For whatever reason, Georgia has welcomed Iranian nefarious economic activity. And they've gotten into bed economically with various Iranian businessmen, quasi-official. And they've gotten into co-investment relationships, and Iran has exploited that. Armenia, perhaps, you know, to a lesser extent, but maybe motivated by the fact that Iran and Azerbaijan don't get along. That's obviously no secret. They're at each other's throats every day. So I would say those two are fertile ground for Iran to try to avoid the sanctions. But as I said, you know, these are not Georgia and Armenia are not huge economies. You're not going to make up for losing Japan or India. You're not going to make it up with Georgia and Armenia. You're just not, just doesn't work.
Interestingly, quite a number of Russian companies, especially Russian banks, have been very reluctant to do business with Iran. Not so much necessarily because of Russian government instructions, as because of their concerns about the repercussions this would have for their interactions with European and American banks. And some of our best assistance in encouraging this attitude has come from Iranian behavior, because faced with the restrictions from the U.S. and European authorities, the response of the Iranian banking system has been to engage in all kinds of camouflage transactions, which violate internationally agreed rules about knowing your customer and about counterterrorism, money laundering, that kind of thing. That has led, for some years now, in fact, Russian and Chinese banks and the Russian and Chinese authorities to agree to a variety of measures warning Iran that it's got to be more transparent in its transactions. The Iranian response to this has generally been to be even more underhanded and covert, which then makes it even easier for the United States government to urge various people around the world to be suspicious. And Armenia is in many ways poorly positioned to do much about this because, in part, Armenia's dependence upon Iran as a trade route. It makes Armenia a relatively difficult place to use as an entrepot for illicitly trading things to Iran.
Nothing question. First of all, I would like to thank both speakers for their comprehensive presentations. So there are certain thoughts that even focused about Iran tries to split P5+1 format into two camps, one European camp and another US camp, let's say, by isolating United States from the whole negotiation process. What do you think about that? I would be appreciated if you could elaborate a little bit more.
That strategy, which certainly was the heart of Iran's strategy and when the P5+1 process started, was remarkably unsuccessful. And you heard Bob Heinhorn refer to the experience about Turkey and Brazil's involvement in trying to come out with a deal. And I think that both the Turks and the Brazilians were shocked to discover that the Chinese and Russians had no patience with this whatsoever, none. And that the UN Security Council votes a significant sanctions resolution that Ken referred to within weeks of Turkey and Brazil coming to an agreement. And then at the subsequent P5+1 meetings, which there were not that many until recently, in fact, the position that the Russian and Chinese government took was fully in solidarity with the Europeans and the Americans. And so, I mean, frankly, to the extent to which there's a split in the P5+1, it's famously that France is very unhappy that the United States is offering as soft terms as it is. And the outlier on the P5+1 is France, which is insisting in much tougher terms. Not that I think the French would stand in the way of an agreement, but it's just they are clearly unhappy. I mean, which leads to the very interesting phenomena that the countries that most urge the United States to take a tough stance in negotiations are France, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Not what we usually think of as a natural alliance.
Yeah, I would say that the Iranians have not been particularly successful. You know, the Europeans, they had the critical dialogue in the early 90s. And the reason they sided with the United States in this P5+1 process is almost somewhat self-interested. Not that they necessarily agreed with the U.S. strategy, but they wanted to head off U.S. military action. I mean, that was the fundamental premise, is we're going to go along, we're going to enact tough sanctions with the United States, we're going to stand with the United States, so that the United States does not then feel it needs to, because if the U.S. sees, you know, we talk about Israel acting, you know, the United States, you know, clearly a nuclear-armed Iran is, you know, many strategists in the United States would consider that a very huge setback if there were a nuclear-armed Iran. Very huge setback. And no president, I mean, no one has to necessarily work for President Obama to know that, you know, any president where Iran became a nuclear-armed state on their watch, that is a huge problem for one's legacy. You know, I would say what I forgot to mention also is, you know, a lot of companies and people, they like to be mentioned in congressional reports. My report is one report you do not want to be mentioned in.
Professor Andeli? Yeah.
Oh, thanks. I have just to comment
The
on
mic, get closer, put the mic closer.
to comment on your comment on Iran, on Georgia. Just to explain a bit more. If we look at Georgia's trade with Iran, imports have skyrocketed by more than 1,590% to 99 to $100 million, you know. So we talk about, in absolute numbers, very low. While the number of Iranian tourists in Georgia has risen by 318% and reached 89,000 annually. The trade between Georgia and Iran increased up to 118 million in 2012. If we compare it with the Georgian-Turkish trade, Georgia's trade with Turkey in 2012 amounts to more than 1.3 billion. So you were absolutely right that it did not bring any benefit, neither to Georgia nor to Iran, too much. But I think a couple of hundreds or maybe 1,000 small Iranian businessmen benefited a bit just to escape terrible situation in Iran. So practically, I agree with you that it was not too much. And yeah, Iranian investments in 2012 were less than $500,000 US in Georgia. So it just to confirm what you're saying.
Well, I'm certainly not, I'm not in any way disputing your figures. I'm not in any way disputing. I would say that a lot of what we see with Iran, I think Patrick would agree, we've looked at the Iranian economy and, you know, figures are very deceptive when it comes to Iran because they do publish information, but it's not, a lot of it is not very solid. They do, I wouldn't say make up things, but they leave out things, they put in extra, a lot of it is these quasi-statal, the bunyads, which means foundation in Persian, you know, they do a lot of transactions in the region which are not recorded. A lot of it is in cash, it's not written down. So I'm not in any way disputing your figures, but I'm just saying there's a bigger picture going on.
Even more, there is one company, Fly Georgia, which stopped operations. You cannot fly anymore. It was partly Iranian.
There's an old American expression that it's better to close the barn door before the horse runs out. And I think that the U.S. concern was that the horse seemed to have gotten loose inside the barn and might run out. And so it urged the Georgian government to make sure the door was closed. And frankly, I think that on the whole it was. But the Iranians have been quite creative at trying to find ways to evade sanctions. And I love some of the front companies they create in Western African countries that hint, if you want to create a front company, it's not great to operate out of Gambia, whose total population is about half the size of the District of Columbia. You stand out conspicuously. But in any case, I think that that's some of what the Iranians were doing, was trying to create front companies in Georgia. And I would agree with you that overwhelmingly the practical impact has been that ordinary Iranians and small Iranian businesses have shown up in Georgia and tried to make purchases at the retail level, things they could take home that it's hard for them to find inside Iran. And that kind of suitcase trade may be important to individuals in Iran, but really doesn't make much overall economic impact.
Office. Back to the gas sector of Iran, I have a question on the Azerbaijani gas field Shah Deniz. It's a known fact that 10% of the Shah Deniz gas is owned by Iranian national oil company. So to what extent this fact can impact on the future projects of bringing the gas to Europe, especially in the terms of ongoing discussions over the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline? Thanks.
The Treasury Department has, on its website, has a very specific reference to the Shah Deniz project. And under the U.S. ban, the U.S. has a ban on trade with Iran, but NICO is a 10% investor. It is a passive. It's not the operator of that project. And the U.S. Treasury Department position is that transactions with the Shah Deniz project are not sanctioned because of NICO. In other words, NICO's participation does not prevent U.S. transactions with the Shah Deniz project.
By the way, there's another project in a similar situation, which bizarrely enough, is in the North Sea, in which Iran is a passive investor. And so this issue has come up with respect to that project as well.
Any other questions, comments? Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Andrani Kovanisyan from the Embassy of Armenia. Follow-up to two previous questions regarding the Iranian investments in the South Caucasus. Mr. Clawson, you mentioned that probably today much of Iranian investments are going to Georgia. I would like to ask whether this calculation takes into account the Iranian investments both in Shah Deniz and also in the South Caucasus pipeline, which were owned also 10% Iranians. And I think this is mentioned in the report of Congressional Research Service. Another issue is mentioned also probably in the report, but I don't remember exactly, but it's something that which could be found in U.S. Department of Energy report, that Iran exports gas not only to Armenia and Turkey, but also to Azerbaijan, if I'm not wrong. The whole, the Nakhichevan exclave is fully dependent, I think, on Azerbaijani gas. But you are true, the main consumer is Turkey for about 90%. And also Turkey, according to the Turkish media, is one of the, is the place where with high Iranian investments today. And according to Turkish media, about 1,500 to 2,000 companies are opened, Iranian companies are opened in Turkey each year. So you mentioned that the close neighborhood of Iran is probably the most fertile ground for evading sanctions, and you talked about some of the neighboring countries of Iran, but you have not dealt upon Turkey much. I would like to ask you to do that, also taking into account some accusations of having some business between Turkey and Iran using United Arab Emirates and this whole gold business. I think you are aware of those facts. Thank you.
Yeah, it's hard to sort of comment on accusations, but I think the Treasury Department went because there were a spate of stories about the gold trade between Iran and Turkey, and actually, Treasury Undersecretary David Cohen felt the need at a hearing to clarify what the U.S. believes is going on, and I think the position was that there is gold entering the Iranian market, but a lot of it is for the consumer. In other words, it's just sale of gold to jewelry stores. The stories were, the press stories were making it sound, and maybe to some extent it's true, but they were making it sound like basically Iran delivers oil and gas and Turkey gives gold. And the Treasury Department tried to clarify and say they don't see that as the main. Well, you know, again, I want to really defer to Treasury on this because, you know, they have the more precise information and they're able to go and track down exactly what's going on. But, you know, I don't want to make any accusations. You know, it's the Treasury Department view is that the stories that were written about this trade were misleading.
The UAE authorities regularly bring to my attention stories in the Turkish press about the state of Turkish-Iranian relations, and it's a subject which the UAE authorities feel very sensitive about, that they feel that the United States is not always as vigorous in pursuing Turkey for the kinds of things that if they were done by the UAE, the U.S. would be objecting to vigorously. But in fact, as I point out to the UAE authorities and to the Turkish authorities for that matter, if you want to talk about U.S. hypocrisy, the real big story in Iranian trade with its neighbors is with Iraq. That's by far and away the largest market for products made in Iran. Iran, by the way, exports gas to Iraq. It exports oil to Iraq. It imports oil also from Iraq. That's another story. And the sales are much larger than with either Turkey or the UAE. And for blatantly political reasons, the United States government does not pursue this that vigorously.
I wanted to also, you know, Bob Einhorn was explaining why Turkey backed off. You know, there was the Tehran Declaration of May 2010, which Turkey backed off. And let's not forget, I mean, Turkey and Iran are on complete opposite sides in Syria. These two are going at it in Syria. Turkey wants Assad gone. Iran wants Assad to stay. These two are fighting it out in Syria. So I don't think it should surprise anybody that Iran-Turkish relations have pulled away since the Syria conflict accelerated.
Thank you so much. Mehmet Talba from Embassy of Azerbaijan. I actually would like to take a minute to make a comment that I wanted to do to our previous friend from Embassy of from Embassy of Armenia. Yes, actually, Azerbaijan. It is that Iran. Nakhchivan receives natural gas from Iran, but it is this swap. It is in order to avoid the freezing winters that we have after the aggression policy of Armenia and after the blockade of Nakhchivan region. It was not possible to have energy resources transported there. And the second thing that it's sometimes really interesting that today we've heard many things about the region, about the economic cooperation between Iran and the region, and everybody, including the distinguished representative from Armenia, at the panel said that yes, the only country having the great economic relations and having no problems with Iran would be Armenia, and they explained it because Armenia simply does not have a choice. Yes, you do have a choice, guys, actually. It's just to stop aggression policy and deliberate the occupied territories, and then you will have a chance to get along with all the projects. And actually, you become repetitive to ask the same question and 10 of in more than 10 panels continuously. Thanks so much. I think that and I thank the panel for clarifying the issue about the Nikos 10% and Shah Deniz. And thanks so much.
Just, I don't want to get into the Armenia-Azerbaijan thing, but just let me comment that, in fact, I would say that Iran's trade relationships with Iraq are better than its trade relationships with Armenia. It's a more important market for Iran, and the political relationships between the Iranian government and the Iraqi government are warmer, deeper, than with Armenia. And, of course, Iraq is a vastly larger market.
Which I think explains why Mr. Prime Minister Maliki's visit this week is not getting all that much attention, as he used to when he came here before.
Questions, comments? Okay.
Okay, I'm Gabriel.
I'm going to ask from both sides here. Let's not have a diplomatic tit for tat between.
It's right on the topic, not discussion, not answer. Just actually, you somehow covered about the issue with the Saudi Arabia involvement in the region. But recently, some situation occurred when Saudi Arabia didn't want to go to the Security Council. And by some experts, it was considered as a challenge to the United States. If we go back about 2 or 3 months, we can recall that Saudi Arabia donated about $100 million to the UN anti-terroristic agency or something like that. And, it's like, from my point of view, it's inconsistent. How can you donate about $100 million and then 2 months later you say, the Security Council is incompetent and insufficient? So how would you comment on this issue, whether it's going to change the Saudi Arabia, challenge to the United States, how it's going to affect to all the region?
Well, just a comment about how Saudi Arabia views Iran, which is, I don't know if Ken's allowed to read WikiLeaks, but if you read the WikiLeaks documents...
It burns his eyes.
Yeah, it burns his eyes. If you read the WikiLeaks documents, you see all the comments from Gulf leaders, the King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia urging the United States to cut off the head of the snake, the Bahraini government urging the United States to bomb Iran, the Qatari emir saying the Iranians lie to us and we lie to them. These are not friendly attitudes. And it would be extremely difficult for the United States and Europe to have the kind of fierce sanctions that we have on Iranian oil if it weren't for the Saudi decision to increase their oil production by approximately 2 million barrels a day to make up for the lost Iranian production. And also if it were not for the fact that the U.S. oil production is going up. Those two factors have made it possible to substitute for Iranian oil and accommodate a growing world demand. And so if it were not for Saudi cooperation, it would not be possible to proceed as vigorously as we have with these sanctions. And the Saudi decision to produce was very explicitly a political decision, very explicitly at the request of the United States government, and very explicitly aimed at Iran. So while there are going to be lots of complaints in the U.S.-Saudi relations, and the two sides have a long history of quarreling with each other, and the Saudis, as you would expect from a smaller country dependent on a larger country, the Saudis are unhappy with the larger country's actions and scared that the larger country is going to abandon them. But the fact is that the United States and Saudi Arabia very much have a common interest in preventing Iran from becoming nuclear. And the Saudis are going to cooperate quite closely with the United States, while urging the United States to do even more.
Yeah, there is no Saudi challenge to the United States. There is no such challenge. They sometimes, play the jealous girlfriend routine or whatever. I don't want to get into it too deeply, but, the problem, South Korea does not worry about the United States and North Korea because the United States and North Korea never were allies. They fought from the time North Korea was formed. Iran, the US and Iran were allies, close allies. So the Saudis, all the Gulf countries, they get the girlfriend analogy isn't too, it's like an ex-girlfriend, and they're worried they're going to go back to the ex, it's very similar. There's a jealousy, the Saudis have us all to themselves, and, the US and Iran have some common interests. I mean, let's put it, Al-Qaeda, 9/11, Saudi, Wahhabi terrorism. Both sides have felt the wrath. Obviously, we felt it in New York. They felt it. They feel it in the region constantly. So, the Saudis know that there are common interests there. And, those interests didn't really go away because the Islamic Republic was formed. I mean, it's been buried by all the other, the schisms that have occurred since the Islamic Revolution. But some of those a lot of those common interests never went away. And that's what, the Saudis, I think, are expressing frustration, that now the U.S., they don't have the U.S. full attention. And particularly, I think it's more about Syria, really. They really want to get Assad out. They really don't understand why the U.S. has not gotten involved in Syria.
Okay. So I think this was an extremely rich panel in both analysis and knowledge. I think it's really rare, again, that you have people that can see the big picture, what should be plowed, but also know the different grains that are there. And so please join me in thanking Dr. Clawson and Dr. Katzman.